If everybody could turn to Matthew 24, where we've been spending some time studying over the past 2 or 3 months. And I'm just going to read a few of the verses there, beginning in verse 15 of Matthew 24. It says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes." And I'll stop reading there. And we looked at verse 15, the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, a few weeks ago, and we saw that that is Satan. And the holy place we saw to be the churches and congregations. And we also saw that God has sealed up His Word. He's closed it up till the time of the end. And that's why this command for those that are in Judea to flee into the mountains would not be activated. It would not be put into effect until the proper time, until the time that God decided when the true believers would come out of the churches and the congregations. And we also saw in verse 15 the word see. "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation," is better understood to be know or perceive. And there's many examples of that. When ye shall know, when God opens His people's understanding to this truth, then verse 16 comes into place. "Let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." And we've been saying all along, well, Jerusalem represents the church, Judea represents the church, and so I'd like to just talk about how we can learn from the Bible that Judea here is not speaking of the land over in the Middle East or the Jews that are currently over in the Middle East, but it's actually referring to those that are in the churches. And we get a big hint in verse 15, because it says the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel standing in the holy place. And we know that since the cross that the temple ceased to be holy, because the veil of the temple was rent in twain. The city of Jerusalem ceased to be holy. The land of Judah, or Israel, ceased to be holy. The Jews, the physical descendants of Abraham, ceased to be the holy people, because God He signified by the renting of the veil the divorce of national Israel, and that they were no longer a special people in His presence. They would become like all the other people of the world. And so as we know that Daniel is the prophecy in the book of Daniel is referring to the end times. This cannot be fulfilled in the 1st century A.D., that this abomination of desolation standing in the holy place is not over in Israel. We won't find this beast, we won't find this abomination of desolation today or any other time over in the Middle East in the land of Israel. You're just not going to find that. But the holy place must be referring to something else. And what is the holy place? What was the holy place during the church age, or from the cross? From the time when the veil of the temple was rent in twain. Where could you find a holy place in the world? Well, what do we call the Bible but the holy book, the holy Bible? It says it on many people's Bibles if you look. It says it on mine. The holy Bible. And churches would have these Bibles, and they would have ministers who would preach from these holy books in what they called a sanctuary. And a sanctuary, that very word itself is used in the Bible to designate a holy place. And so the congregation would gather into the pews in the sanctuary, and the minister would preach from the holy book. And more than that, what made the churches and congregations a holy place was the fact that Jesus said that he would be in the midst of the congregations. Now that's what would distinguish it from a fellowship. That's what would distinguish it from the fact that we have the holy book here, and we're gathered. I don't think anybody can confuse this basement hall with a holy place, but we're gathered here together. We're assembling, and yet Jesus never said he'll be in the midst of the fellowships. We're all gathered here as individuals, each one of us. We're just individual people that happen to come together today, and we're listening to what the Bible has to say, but we're not a congregation. We're not gathered here for any other purpose other than the fellowship with God through the Bible. But in the church, in the sanctuary, and Jesus said he would be in the midst of the congregation. So you had the presence of God, which is extremely important, because that's what the Ark of the Testament inside the Holy of Holies represented, the presence of God amongst the people of Israel. And the veil of the temple is rent, and so it was as though God had left them. God had departed from them. And yet God was in the midst of the churches throughout the church age, and so the churches and congregations could be identified as the holy place. And the abomination of desolation is standing in the holy place, it says in Matthew 24:15. And when you come to realize this, when you come to understand what exactly or where that holy place is, but then which means Judea. Now again, God doesn't make it easy. He never comes right out. He could have written this 1,000 different ways so we would understand it. But he's using the language of the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, even though Matthew 24 is a prophecy dealing with the end of the world, and to a very large degree, the Jews have nothing to do with it. Now, they could have something to do with it as far as Jews could be believers, but for the most part, God is just using types and figures that he set up through the nation of Israel to teach truth to us today. And let's just see how God does that. For instance, turn to Acts chapter 7. In Acts 7, and look at two verses 37 and 38. It says, "This is that Moses, which said unto the children of Israel, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness, with the angel which spake to him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the lively oracles to give unto us." Now, that verse might be familiar to some of you, but do you see what it's referring to? Israel was with Moses in the wilderness. The churches and congregations weren't established at that point. That was, 1400 something BC, or 1407 to, they came out in, 1447, wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, but 1407. So we're talking 1400 plus years from the formation of the churches after the cross, and God uses the word ecclesia, the Greek word ecclesia, to refer to the nation of Israel that was in the wilderness with Moses. He calls it the church that was in the wilderness. The same word church that you find with Peter, that the gates of hell shall not prevail against. It's the same word church you find throughout the New Testament. this ecclesia was in the wilderness. And it's significant. When we read the Old Testament, we keep reading about the congregation of Israel. The congregation of Israel. What we call churches today, congregations. It's a similar idea because they're very similar in nature as God is using them to typify the churches and congregations of the New Testament. They were the church in the wilderness. Or let's also see how God encourages the New Testament believer to look upon Israel as an example. Turn to 1 Corinthians 10. And I'll start reading in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 10. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And then skip down a little bit to verse 11, 1 Corinthians 10. Now all these things happen unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. And so when we're reading about Israel, we're reading about what happened to them. God is saying, take heed, take warning. They were examples to you, New Testament churches and congregations. And that's why when we see the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, when we see the King Nebuchadnezzar destroying Jerusalem and Judah, God is telling us that you can use that as an example for what could happen to you. Well, who's going to destroy the New Testament church? Satan, once he's loosed, who is typified by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Or let's also look at Hebrews 4. Hebrews 4 in the first couple of verses. It says, let us therefore fear, lest the promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them. That's pointing back to Israel. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. So they had, guess what? They had the gospel just like we have the gospel. They were the church in the wilderness, just like the New Testament congregations were the church. What happened to them were our examples. They were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. You see how God links us back to Israel again and again throughout the Bible. Or let's go to Romans 2. Romans 2, and we'll see one big reason why God is referring to Judea. Why is he speaking of Judea? Why does he talk about Jerusalem? In Romans 2, it says in verse 28, for he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh. Tell that to some people over in Middle East, and they're going to be surprised. Tell that to, we have people in this country that are very much Jews, and they would say they're descendants of Abraham, and they are physically. But the Bible says you're not a Jew just because you're circumcised. You're not a Jew because you're in the bloodline of Abraham. That doesn't make you a Jew. You're not a Jew. Well, what is a Jew? It says in verse 29, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. In other words, if we're saved, if we have a new heart and a new spirit, we're circumcised in our heart, God has quickened us. He's taken out our heart of stone, given us a heart of flesh. You're a Jew. You're a Jew. And so here we have spiritual Jews. And throughout the world, anyone who becomes saved becomes a spiritual Jew. Where do Jews live? Where do Jews reside? Jews are part of the nation of Israel, or Judah. And so within the congregations throughout the church age, God was saving people. They became spiritual Jews. And so He speaks to the congregations as Judea. That's where the Jews are. That's where they live. And this is why in Matthew 24 and many other places that He's looking at Judea. This is why when we become saved and after all the elected become saved, we're taken up to New Jerusalem, the heavenly city of God that comes down, and then the new heavens and the new earth. We're all citizens of the New Jerusalem when we've become a child of God. And so there's many verses that link the body of believers to Israel, to being spiritual Jews. Look at Romans 9. Romans chapter 9 says in verse 6, it's the same teaching as Romans 2. Not as though the word of God hath taken none effect, for they are not all Israel which are of Israel. It means you're not a Jew just because you're circumcised. And then in verse 7, neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. So the elect are the children of Abraham. We're the seed of Abraham. We are the true spiritual Jews. We are the Israel of God, as Galatians 6 puts it. We are the people that are still have a relationship to God. Or look at Romans 11, and many theologians stumble on these verses because they fail to understand that principle that there are spiritual Jews, that the true believers, the elect people of God, are looked upon by God as being Israel spiritually. It says in Romans 11, verse 25, For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel. Now that's referring to Israel, the physical descendants, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Now the Gentiles are the people out in the world that God's going to save. He has elected them to salvation. Blindness has happened to Israel until every one of God's elect becomes saved. And after every one of God's elect becomes saved, and so, or in this manner, all Israel shall be saved. Now you see, when you look at Romans 2 and you see a true Jew is one inwardly, when you see Galatians 6 says that the one saved is the Israel of God, and when you put it all together, we realize the Gentiles comprise Israel as well as the saved Jews. It's everyone that becomes a child of God, all Israel shall be saved. And that's coming to pass as we speak. God is gathering a great multitude, and finally the last one of His elect will be saved, and the end will come. And in many ways, in really countless ways, we're not going to spend too much time, but God is picturing the true believers as Israel, and of course the corporate body is right along with that. It's the same idea. You see how God, in Galatians 4, Remember these verses which refer to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is in Judah. In Galatians 4, it says in verse 22, "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who is of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth the bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is." The word answereth is corresponds. And so it's saying Hagar represents the covenant of the law by which nobody can become saved. So she's really heading up all those that are seeking to get right with God by their own works, and they're unsaved individuals. And that's what we find many of in the churches. And this corresponds with Jerusalem, which now is, or the Jerusalem which typifies the churches and congregations in this world, and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. That is the heavenly Jerusalem, where we obtain a citizenship. We enter in through salvation. Some people during the church age belong to both. They belonged to their local church, but they were saved. So they also had a membership, the citizenship in Jerusalem above. And some people, they're only citizens of the earthly, of the present Jerusalem, which now is. They're members of the church. But they're not saved. They know nothing about belonging to the one above. And so they are in bondage. All that are in that situation are in bondage. They're still in their sins, and they're still under the wrath of God. And again, you see how God is using two Jerusalems to typify all professing Christians, all professing people. You belong to one or the other. During the church age, you could belong to both. And yet he's using the language of Jerusalem. Just as in Matthew 24, he's referring to Judea. And let's go back there in Matthew 24, and in verse 16, after we know or have learned that the abomination of desolation is in the holy place, he's within the church, he is come up out of the bottomless pit, he has been loosed to wreak havoc amongst the congregations. Then let them which be in Judea, in the church, flee into the mountains. Then we have a command to flee. We have a command to flee. Just as God says in Revelation 18 verse 4, "Come out of her, my people." Just as Lot was fleeing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we find God is giving a command to flee. Now, a command to flee is actually for our benefit, because this word is used in a few places. When we look at one in Matthew 23, in verse 33, where Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, and he says, "Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye flee?" That word escape is the same as flee. "The damnation of hell." See, you flee, you want to escape the damnation of hell. Whatever happens in your life, the last thing, if you were of a right mind, you would ever want is to be cast down into hell. But how can ye flee that? How can you escape that? Because they're so blind, and they're thinking that he is of Satan. There is no salvation for them. They're going to reject Christ as of Beelzebub. And so they're guaranteeing their own damnation. Well, that's what that's what God is telling us. This word has involved escaping for your life. It has within it the idea of someone is after you, seeking to devour you, to destroy you, to ruin you eternally. And so God is saying, flee to the mountains. We're into the mountains. Let's go back to Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 50, Jeremiah 50, and verses 27 and 28. Now Jeremiah is a book dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem, which pictures, it points to the destruction of the church. And it says in Jeremiah 50, verse 27, slay all her bullocks, let them go down to the slaughter. Woe unto them, for their day is come, the time of their visitation. The voice of them that flee and escape out of the land of Babylon, to declare in Zion the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of the Lord our God, the vengeance of His temple. So there, God is dealing with the destruction of Babylon, and He's saying that this is the voice of them that flee and escape out of Babylon. Go over to Jeremiah 51, and it says in verse 6, flee out of the midst of Babylon and deliver every man his soul. And you can see how the idea of fleeing for your own sake, for the sake of your own soul, is involved. Deliver every man his soul. Be not cut off in her iniquity, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance. He will render unto her a recompense. Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, and made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her, take balm for her pain. If so be she may be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her, and let us go everyone into his own country. For her judgment reacheth unto heaven, and is lifted up even to the skies. And then verse 11, make bright the arrows, gather the shields. The Lord hath raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his device is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple. And again, Babylon, Jerusalem are synonyms. They're interchangeable. They're representing the churches and congregations. But God is saying here in Jeremiah as well as in Matthew 24, flee. Flee out of the midst. Or let's see how it's brought together with Luke 21. In Luke 21, in verse 20, it says there, and when ye shall see Jerusalem, and that I believe that word see is the same as in Matthew 24:15. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein too. For these be the days of vengeance, and that all things which are written may be fulfilled. These be the days of vengeance. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But doesn't that have application at the end of the world? Well, he just told us in the context of fleeing out of the midst of Jerusalem or Judea, these be the days of vengeance. Remember, Jeremiah said, the voice of them that flee, which declares the vengeance of the Lord. You see, when believers come out of the churches and congregations, we do so quietly, we don't tell anybody, we don't say anything. Or do we share with people? What do we tell them? Well, we tell them what we've learned from the Bible. Judgment begins at the house of God. We tell them that according to the Bible, the church age has come to an end, that God is pouring out His wrath upon the congregations, that it is the vengeance of His temple, that He has begun to judge His people. It will soon transition into the final judgment, but it's begun. These be the days of vengeance. And that's a very scary thought, that God is now at this point taking vengeance. But what is He taking vengeance upon the church for? What's the reason that God is avenging Himself upon the church? Well, let's go to Psalm 79. Psalm 79. And it says in verse 1, O God, the heathen are come into Thine inheritance. Thy holy temple have they defiled. They have laid Jerusalem on heaps. The dead bodies of Thy servants have they given to be meat unto the fowls of the heaven, the flesh of Thy saints unto the beasts of the earth. Their blood have they shed like water round about Jerusalem, and there was none to bury them. And that points to the dead bodies of the two witnesses of Revelation 11. They're just laying in the open. No one's burying them. And then look down to verse 10 of Psalm 79. Wherefore should the heathen say, Where is their God? Let Him be known among the heathen in our sight by the revenging of the blood of Thy servants which is shed. See, God is, look at this psalm as pointing towards the destruction of the church, Satan's overcoming the camp of the saints, and God is going to revenge the blood of the servants which is shed. Or let's go to, let's go to Revelation 6. A few verses here, but I'll shorten it up a bit. Revelation 6. In verses 9 and 10, And when He had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost Thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell in the earth? How long till you avenge our blood? See, that's the cry that's been going up since the very beginning by the believers that have been slain, either physically or spiritually. They are crying out to God for vengeance. Let's go to Matthew 23. In Matthew 23, this is really laid out by Jesus in verse 34, where He says, Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall ye scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias son of Barachias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together as a hen gathereth her chicks? Jesus is charging Jerusalem with all the blood of all the prophets from Abel, who goes all the way back to the beginning, doesn't he? He was the son of Adam and Eve. He was the first man murdered, the first man slain upon the earth, to the blood of Zacharias. Now, we would expect that to go at least to like the end of the Old Testament, but it doesn't. It's not an all-encompassing statement of history, which we would think, due to the context, from the beginning of Abel to Zacharias. Well, let's take a look. Let's first look at Abel and see what Jesus has in view here. In Genesis 4, this is the account of Abel's murder. And it says in verse 9 of Genesis 4, "And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." Remember the saints in Revelation 6? "How long, O Lord, till you avenge our blood?" It was the cry going up to God. Remember Psalm 79? There was the cry of those who were unburied. "How long do you avenge our blood?" And Abel is said, his blood is said to cry unto God from the ground from the very first days of history. A cry is being raised up to God for vengeance from the very beginning, from the time when Cain slew Abel. Now let's go to Zacharias, who would be found in 2 Chronicles 24. 2 Chronicles 24, and first let's look at verse 15 of 2 Chronicles 24. "But Jehoiada waxed old, and was full of days when he died. 130 years old was he when he died." Jehoiada the priest died at 130. From Abel unto Zacharias, who is the son of Jehoiada. And Jehoiada just happened to die at 130. So we put a zero on that, you have 1,300. Put another zero, you have 13,000 years. Because the number 13 is in view, the number 10. 10 times 13 is 130. Multiples of 10 give you 13,000 years. See, God is making an all-encompassing statement. He's going back to Abel. He's saying from the very first child of God that died, his blood is crying to me unto heaven for vengeance, unto Zacharias, who's the son of Jehoiada, who dies at 130. And it wasn't long after Jehoiada's death that the king of Judah, what's his name? Josiah, thanks Lester, the king of Judah slays the son of Jehoiada, Zacharias, between the altar and the temple. Because the number 13 is what's important. The number of 13 pointing to 13,000 years of history, which fell in 1988, which begins the time of the Great Tribulation. From the first prophet slain until the last, now these be the days of vengeance when the Great Tribulation gets underway. And also, look at Zacharias in 2 Chronicles 24. It says in verse 21, "And they conspired against him and stoned him with stones at the commandment of the king in the court of the house of the Lord. Then Joash, the king," is that what you said, Lester? All right, Lester got it right. "Then Joash the king," lost my place. "Thus Joash the king remembered not the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but slew his son, and when he died," this is Zacharias, listen to what he said. He said, "The Lord look upon it and require it." Vengeance. Vengeance. The blood of Abel cries unto God for vengeance. The blood of Zacharias, slain between the altar and the court, is crying unto God, "Require it. Avenge my blood." These be the days of vengeance. They begin now. They begin during the Great Tribulation. God is exacting revenge and pouring out His wrath. You know, judgment means wrath. Judgment means anger. Judgment means fury. God is pouring it out on the churches and congregations presently, and it will soon transition into the final day of judgment. And of course, there's no comparison to that. To be cast into hell eternally, that is awful, awful vengeance and wrath. But But God is letting us know these be the days of vengeance, transitioning into the final day, and all the ungodly being cast into hell. But He is taking vengeance upon Jerusalem, that has slain all the prophets from Abel to Zacharias. He's taking vengeance on who Jerusalem represents. The church. The church. And let's go to Revelation 18. Go to Revelation 18. Look at verse 20. Speaking of the destruction of Babylon, another synonym for the churches and congregations. Rejoice over her, thou heaven, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God hath avenged you on her. And then down in verse 24, and in her, this is Babylon, was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who were slain upon the earth. You see how there's no distinction. Jesus said Jerusalem slew all the prophets. They're guilty of all the blood. Babylon is guilty of all the blood because they're synonyms. They're both representing the churches and congregations. And God is going to exact vengeance. Now, let's read into Revelation 19 and we'll finish up. It says, and after these things I heard a great voice of much people in heaven, saying, Alleluia, salvation and glory and honor and power unto the Lord our God. For true and righteous are His judgments, for He hath judged the great whore, which did corrupt the earth with her fornication, and hath avenged the blood of His servants at her hand. You see, the language there is past tense. Past tense. He has judged her. He hath avenged her. And now there's nothing but the casting away into hell and the completion of the vengeance of God, the completion of His pouring out of His wrath forevermore. And so we're currently in the stage where vengeance in these days is taking place, but there's still hope. There's still a possibility for someone who is not yet fled to the mountain, that those in Judea flee to the mountain. And guess what? The mountain isn't the fellowship. It's not salvation coming to a fellowship. Let them which are in Judea flee to the mountain. It's not home, looking at your Bible in your house. That's not a mountain. Flee to the mountain means fleeing to Christ in salvation. If you don't have salvation, maybe you left the church, but you haven't fled to the mountain. If you're not truly born again, you are going to end up in hell as well as anyone. And so when God commands, then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountain. Don't stop off anywhere else. Don't think this is going to make me okay with God, and so I'll escape the damnation to come. You must go to Christ. There must be salvation. It's the only way that we can come out from under the wrath of God. Okay, let's stop here and we'll pick it up again next time. Let's close.